Looking for the closest thing to true powder without hopping on a plane? As the northernmost ski resort in Vermont, Jay Peak is steadily the best bet for natural snowfall on the East Coast. Jay Peak also stands out in a number of other ways, hosting Vermont's only aerial tram, as well as some very demanding terrain. But the resort is very far from key US metropolitan areas, so does it stand out in enough ways to be right for you? In this video, we'll go through Jay Peak's overall mountain experience, and then we'll go through how the resort stacks up in our overall rankings. If you find this information helpful, be sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you don't miss any of our content. And if you haven't already, be sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram, where you can follow along as we travel around the peaks and share our first impressions before they ever make it up in our videos. Jay Peak's defining characteristic is its snow. The resort consistently receives the highest snow totals in the Northeast, seeing over 300 inches of natural snowfall in a typical season, nearly double that of some of its competitors. This results in regular powder days, something that's hard to say about any other East Coast ski resort. In addition, this helps Jay Peak maintain a much better base than its competitors, allowing it to offer more interesting terrain throughout a typical season. But while Jay has the best natural snow in the east, conditions on off days can become surprisingly poor. Partially as a result of its strange topography, the resort faces some of the most wind-exposed slopes in Vermont, resulting in scoured, icy terrain in many places. Jay Peak's snowmaking covers 80% of trails, which may sound like a lot, but this falls behind near 100% coverage of some competitors. And even with this coverage ratio, the snowmaking isn't always consistent on every trail, and often only occurs on a fraction of the trails that are equipped for it. These circumstances often mean that despite the better natural snowfall, Jay Peak is slower to open early season terrain than competitors further south. While snowmaking operations are good on the trails they're consistently employed on, a notable minority of Jay Peak's runs face thin cover throughout a typical course season. And even if it has snowed and conditions are good, a solid chunk of days fall victim to wind holds. Days like these often leave the sheltered jet chair as the only lift serving terrain above the learning areas, which turns the whole experience into a madhouse. The one place that's often spared from the wind is the trees. Jay Peak's glades often host the best snow conditions at the resort, let alone anywhere in Vermont, thanks to collecting much of the snow blown off open slopes. Even if conditions on regular trails are nearly unskiable, the glades can hold excellent powder stashes for days after a storm. In fact, Jay's glades are just overall excellent, with solid intermediate and advanced options off every lift that are consistently skiable throughout the winter. Speaking of terrain, Jay Peak may not be the biggest resort in Vermont, but it does offer a very strong variety of runs. The resort is made up of a main mountain face, the top of which is served exclusively by the aerial tram, as well as two sub-peaks that include a significant portion of the resort's terrain. This distinctive setup gives Jay some of the most unique terrain per acre on the East Coast, and very few runs really feel the same. That being said, there are a number of great mountains in Vermont for beginners, but Jay Peak is not one of them. The resort has 3 beginner zones served by dedicated lifts and magic carpets, but above these areas, there isn't a single green trail. And while the beginner areas are designated as slow zones, Upper Mountain Blues and Blacks filter into nearly all of these runs, leaving little isolated terrain for beginners to learn on. Besides the true bunny hills served by the carpets, the one truly sheltered mountain zone for beginners is the Village Double area. And if you're a less experienced skier or snowboarder, this pod is probably the best place to get comfortable before progressing to other areas. Jay Peak starts to make much more sense for intermediates, although those unfamiliar with the mountain should still be careful about which trails to choose. Every lift serves groomed blue cruisers, and Upper Mountain Blues are home to the best views on the mountain. Lower mountain areas host numerous intermediate glade runs. However, some of Jay's blue runs are on the harder side, and a handful remain ungroomed throughout the winter, resulting in conditions that guests who might be comfortable on blues at other Vermont resorts may find too taxing. That said, every mountain area has at least one groomed blue run, so guests who can do blues at a typical Vermont resort will never find it impossible to get down. Jay Peak is by no means the best freestyle mountain in Vermont, but it does offer a handful of terrain park zones near its stateside base. These parks are geared more towards less experienced terrain park goers, but they're well designed for progression, and a decent variety of boxes, rails, and jumps exist, including some in glade zones. Jay Peak is really best for experts, and terrain for experienced guests is what really sets it apart from competitors. Every major mountain area boasts numerous steeps, including narrow mogul runs, glades of varying widths, and a few groomers that allow for serious speed runs. Jay Peak doesn't have a double black rating, but don't be fooled. Some of these runs leave little room for error and would be easily rated with this difficulty at other resorts. Jay Peak's most intense terrain is located off the top of the tram. The tram face is home to some of the hardest terrain in Vermont, with blood-curdling chutes that sustain perilous pitches and include really tight trees. Some of these lines are so steep that they're essentially impossible to maintain control on without fresh snow. If it's not a powder day, the unmarked face trails to the skiers right of the tram are essentially death traps due to uncontrollably icy terrain that plunges right into unforgiving, unskiable trees. But Jay Peak's primary face chutes, which are to the skiers left of the tram, are sheltered from the wind, and while still incredibly technical, they often hold fresh powder longer than any other place on the mountain. Visitors can thank Jay's natural snowfall for its extremes. If it weren't for the exceptional snow base, it's unlikely that this type of terrain would be skiable at all. Jay Peak isn't the tallest or most substantial mountain on the East Coast, but for its size, it boasts quite the feel. Pictures alone undersell how striking the peak is, with its jagged rock face conveying a presence unlike any other inbound terrain feature in Vermont. A ride up the tram, which travels at a height far above most normal lifts, affords bird's-eye vistas of numerous mid-mountain resort zones and close-up views of the tram face itself. The resort's surroundings are quite remote, and a lack of on-mountain buildup makes for a local, uncommercialized vibe, especially compared to some of Jay Peak's most popular competitors. But Jay's lack of buildup does make for a couple of modest drawbacks. Except for at the top of the tram, there are no mid-mountain lodges, making it impossible to stop in for a break without traveling all the way down to one of the bases. And while the base lodges are pleasant enough, they're not the most convenient to access from certain mountain areas, especially when you're near the top. Jay Peak gets extraordinarily cold throughout the winter. It's often one of the coldest mountains in the Northeast, and the lack of indoor shelter can make it really unpleasant to be at the resort. Also not helpful on cold days is Jay's lift setup. The resort has two base areas, the tram side base and the state side base, and both have their issues. While the aerial tram clearly protects occupants from the elements, this lift isn't exactly practical to lap due to its long headways, and it can generate long lines on busy days. None of Jay Peak's other major lifts make for especially enjoyable rides. The Flyer Quad is the other major lift out of tramside and services the same lower two-thirds of terrain as the tram, but it's located directly in a wind funnel. And while the lift is high speed, the exposed ride will leave guests frigid after just one trip up. The stateside bases Bonaventure and Jet lifts are thankfully more sheltered, but both are quite slow. At least the lines for these chairlifts are never too bad, only getting up to 10 or so minutes, even on the busiest days. Both bases have a beginner chairlift that only goes a third of the way up, and they're skiable between one another, meaning that it's never too difficult to get between the two base areas. Contrary to essentially every other competitive Vermont ski resort, Jay Peak is not a partner on either of the Epic or Icon pass suites. Instead, Jay Peak offers 2 days of access on the Indy Pass, a much cheaper multi-resort product that primarily provides access to smaller, more regional resorts. While multiple Indy Pass partners enforce severe blackout dates on the product's base pass, Jay Peak does not, making it much more practical to plan a weekend trip for than other Indy offerings. Jay Peak sits just below Vermont's border with Canada, making it further away from major United States cities than every other ski resort in the state. In fact, much of the scenery visible from the resort's upper mountain is actually across the border. A drive from New York takes a grueling 6.5 hours, while the trek from Boston is 4 hours. However, Jay Peak is significantly more convenient to reach from Montreal than other Vermont destinations, sitting just 2 hours from Quebec's largest city. In many cases, the resort sees more Canadian guests than United States guests due to these circumstances. Jay Peak plays into these factors, with its logo including a variation of the maple leaf and the Canadian flag prominently displayed in many areas of the resort. Jay Peak offers 3 on-site hotel accommodations, as well as an assortment of ski-in, ski-out condos in lower mountain areas. The Hotel J sits at the resort's main base, and it's connected to unique amenities such as an indoor water park and an ice hockey rink, although these do cost extra to access. The higher-end Tram House is Jay's newest hotel, offering generous kitchenette and suite accommodations. The Stateside Hotel is the most economical option of the three, with no-frills rooms at the secondary Stateside base. A handful of budget inns and vacation home rental options can also be found within 15 to 30 minutes of the resort. The area surrounding Jay Peak is very rural with no real town, and as a result, there's very little going on. There are a handful of bars and restaurants, including one in each hotel, but guests expecting anything close to a real party town will be disappointed. That said, Jay's base lodges and hotels do host live music most weekends during the core season, so there is always a bit of a vibe at the resort during peak times. So Jay Peak's extraordinary East Coast strengths can make it very well worth the drive, provided you get there on a non-windy day, it snowed within the past few days, and you're not a beginner. But a trip up to Jay is a bit of a roll of the dice due to regular wind holds as well as lackluster resiliency measures. This means that while it's hard to beat Jay when conditions are decent, the long drive can be a complete bust if you arrive at the wrong time. But Jay Peak does have one additional trick up its sleeve against its major competitors: reasonable lift ticket prices. Peak days go for just over $100 at the ticket window, which is far below what the most expensive mountains in Vermont charge. Jay's ticket rates make it a much more plausible last-minute trip choice than most of its competitors, and in many cases, the resort will be best enjoyed by those who book with short notice and a good sense of the snow and wind conditions. Now let's go through how Jay Peak stacks up in our overall rankings, which are determined by the following 10-category mountain score. Jay Peak receives what's probably the best natural snowfall on the East Coast and gets a 7 for snow, the highest rating in this category east of the Rockies. Despite the strong natural accumulation, Jay Peak could use some work on its snowmaking and grooming operations, and wind holds are common, and the resort gets a 4 for resiliency. Jay Peak is on the smaller side, but still more than reasonable for the East Coast, with a 385-acre skiable footprint and a 940-acre footprint from boundary to boundary, giving it a 3 for size. Despite less than ideal easier terrain options, Jay Peak's glade and tram-face terrain really stands out, and the resort gets a 6 for terrain diversity. Jay Peak boasts demanding terrain in every major mountain area, and its tram lines are about as tough as they get in Vermont, and the resort gets a 9 for challenge. Jay Peak has the only tram in Vermont, but its other lifts are either slow or really exposed to wind, and the resort gets a 4 for lifts. Jay Peak doesn't have all that many lift redundancies, and lines for the tram can get quite lengthy, but lines for the other lifts are never too bad, at least compared to other Vermont mountains, even on peak days, and the resort gets a 7 for crowd flow. Jay's lack of mid-mountain lodges can be a pain on cold and windy days, and the resort gets a 4 for facilities. Jay Peak is straightforward to get around, with a forgiving footprint and clear signage for the most part, and the resort gets an 8 for navigation. And finally, mountain aesthetic. Jay Peak may not be the largest resort on the East Coast, but there's nothing else even remotely like its tram phase, and the resort gets a 7 in this category. These categories add up to an overall score of 59, placing Jay Peak third in our Vermont rankings as of January 2023. Jay Peak definitely has its issues, but no other resort in the state can even come close in natural snowfall, and few can match its glade and expert terrain, footprint distinctiveness, and relative lack of crowds. Jay Peak is under new ownership as of late 2022, and it remains to be seen whether any lift, snowmaking, or facilities upgrades are in the pipeline. With some quality infrastructure enhancements, it could easily become the best overall mountain in the state. For more information on Jay Peak and over 70 other North American ski resort destinations, check out peakrankings.com. See you for the next one.